Welcome to our condensed presentation on Lead with Outcomes, New Building Blocks of Human Capital Management. My name is Mark Felix, and joining me is Butler Newman, and we're from GP Strategies. What we're going to be covering today are a few things, starting with the building blocks of human capital management, what we actually mean by that, a new way of thinking about driving to business outcomes. We'll then get into what we consider to be an outcome-based approach, which may be a different way of thinking about individual outcomes than you have historically. And then we'll get more tactical, and we'll talk very much about role excellence in action. So how does it all come together? Now, let me step back and give you a very, very brief overview of GP Strategies, and then Butler and I will introduce ourselves. GP Strategies is focused on helping our clients execute strategy through their people. Sometimes we call that the nexus or the intersection of where business strategy and people strategy meet. And in doing that work, we focus in a few areas. One, we do full outsourcing of learning organizations. Two, we provide human capital management technology solutions. And then third is the part of the business where Butler and I reside, which is in the consulting arm, which focuses on helping to drive people performance from leaders to managers to performers. And we do that through consulting engagements and training engagements. And that's very much what we're talking about today. How do we maximize the people effectiveness through a focus on outcomes? So with that, let's do quick backgrounds. I'm in the leadership practice at GP Strategies. My history has been in leadership, most recently a global CEO for a leadership and sales consultancy. Butler, you want to go through your?
Sure. Thanks, Mark, and welcome, everyone. My name is Butler Newman. I head the Organizational Excellence Practice for GP Strategies, as Mark has said before. So with that, let's just dive in, Mark.
Excellent. So what's been fascinating in this conference is hearing how many references, how many allusions there's been to business outcomes. Clearly that's not a new concept, that's a focus that learning professionals have had for some time, but it seems to be omnipresent now in virtually every main stage and every breakout that we've seen. And to be very frank, that's been music to our ears, because that has been our focus for quite some time as well. What we're particularly excited about and what we're going to get into today is what we would call the operationalizing of how to produce business strategy. The link between what leaders do and what performers produce. In our view, that is the number one way in which to operationalize that idea and to ensure or raise the likelihood that you'll actually get the outcomes which you're aspiring to get. Let me start by painting the big picture, and then we'll get into much, much more granular detail. So beginning with the high level, when we talk about leadership at GP Strategies, we're talking about leaders at all levels. Leaders are doing a number of things that, at the end of the day, have to produce value. Value for different stakeholder groups, whether they be shareholders, whether they be employees, whether they be clients and customers. But if that's not happening, leadership is not being effective. In our view, the number one way in which leaders can help ensure that that value is created is with a direct line connection to what individuals are producing, the outcomes they are generating. Now, this is where I talk about a slightly different definition of what we mean by outcomes, and Butler will expand on this later. But what we're talking about are outcomes that are value adding. And you'll see in parentheses the words below top performers. We want to benchmark the outcomes that the very, very best are producing, particularly in those critical roles. And if we do that, and we can shift the performance curve, and we can get others to move closer toward those top performer outcomes, we know that that ultimately will help you in your aspiration to achieve business outcomes. So that's the connectivity from leaders to individuals to business outcomes. The question then is, how do leaders make this happen? So two primary ways. The first is going to be around setting direction, and then the second is establishing conditions for success. Let me take those in turn. First is setting direction. When we talk about setting direction, we're talking about some very, what you might even consider common things. We're talking about having a vision, setting a clear mission, underpinning those with a strong set of values, and then having a logical, coherent strategy to execute. So vision, mission, values, strategy. On the one hand, that is a very common sense approach. Sometimes, though, when a leader sets that direction, it either isn't clear, isn't cascaded, or isn't motivational or inspirational. And those are all fundamental components of what setting direction means. And once that's done, part of the groundwork has been laid, but then we need to establish the conditions for success. When we talk about establishing conditions, we're talking about ensuring that the culture is right to help individuals produce their outcomes, they have the resident capability required, they're engaged, and they're enabled. Let me talk about these briefly. From a culture standpoint, it's around establishing the culture that will allow people to do their best work. In most organizations, we're looking for high performance. But if you think beyond that, there's choices to be made about the type of culture which you're creating. For example, do you want it to be a risk-averse culture or a risk-taking culture? Do you want it to be a collaborative, cross-boundaries culture, or do you seek to have an organization in which the culture is one of healthy competition internally? Those are choices. The decision about those choices should be what's going to support the individual in producing his or her best work. From a capability standpoint, we're talking about the skills and knowledge people need in order to do their jobs most effectively. So that happens at the leader level, at the manager, at the performer level. It includes both soft skills and technical skills. That's the work that so many of us in this room are involved in doing. An engagement perspective, when we talk about engagement, we're talking about the desire to expend that discretionary effort such that people will do their best work. So for us, it's the intersection of personal satisfaction and success with organizational success. And where those two things come together is where we're maximizing that personal journey and that organizational journey. And then finally, we're talking about enablement. What are the processes? What are the tools that people need to get their job done, to produce the work? As we often say, you can have a great culture, you can have an organization with very, very strong capability, they can be highly engaged, but if they're fundamentally hobbled because they don't have the systems and tools required, it is unlikely they're going to get those outcomes. So leadership, in our perspective, is entirely in service of helping create the environment in which individuals can produce the outcomes that are value-adding, which creates business outcomes. Now, where that is most keenly impacted, keenly felt, directly from individual performance, is through the first-level leaders. So we'll talk more about first-level leaders, but that is the integral position in organizations where the daily coaching conversations where the mentoring happens, where the day-to-day work gets done. And so we'll expand on that particular aspect on it. But I'll leave you with one thought on this, which is that to get business outcomes, leaders are focused on individuals, and everything in between is what makes it happen. Now, let me go ahead and set brief environmental context in the world in which we're working today, and then Butler will go on from there. So the world of work, this is not going to be a surprise to anyone in this room. It is challenging. So all we've got on this slide are some of the examples. So many of your team members will work in a matrixed environment. They're probably working across geographies, maybe across time zones. It is multiple reporting lines. It is very, very difficult. The ways in which we communicate have become more abbreviated, whether it be chat or iMessage. And the reality is that it makes leading and helping individuals drive the production of value-added outcomes more challenging. So let me give you some examples. If you're an individual performer, you probably have more tasks on your plate than you know what to do. Sometimes it can be hard to discern which of those are most critical. If you're a first-level leader, you probably arose through your technical capability, but ultimately maybe don't have the capacity or strength or knowledge around how best to manage people, and you're spending your time fighting fires. And if you're a learning professional, what that oftentimes means is you have a tremendous number of resources to help people, but we're not as sure in terms of how targeted or specific or where those learning resources should be allocated. So that's the world in which we live. And it's our view that Lead with Outcomes is one way to cut through that clutter to help you be more focused in how you help your organization drive success.
Thanks, Mark. So what does this mean, these outcomes that Mark have been talking about? That's where we're gonna go to the next level of depth on that now. And to do that, we study the world of work through the lens of top performers. I think we have one of the best jobs in the world, absolutely, because we learn so much from how the top performers, those who are really excelling in their roles, go about their work. And we have studied top performers in multiple roles, multiple industries, and across the globe. It's really a rewarding work, but it's also very enlightening. So what do we mean, though, by top performer? So as an example, let's go to a relatively simple role, and that of a call center representative. So Joe, he's our call center representative in this case. And if we look at Joe, everyone points to him as a top performer. And there are certain criteria that we help to formulate, but we won't go into that today. But Joe has been identified as a top performer. And so part of what we do is talk to Joe, and in this case, actually observe the work that he's doing. And as we're watching Joe, and you got to understand Joe's environment, the context in which he's working. Joe is sitting there with literally 3 huge computer screens in front of him. The company, the industry that he is in is healthcare. There have been lots of mergers and acquisitions, so from an IT standpoint, he has literally 16 different systems in which he must go to address questions from callers. So Joe's there, and we're watching him, and not once, not twice, but multiple times, Joe answers the phone, and before the caller can even get their question formulated, Joe has navigated to the correct system out of the 16 to answer their question. So we stop, we pull Joe off the floor, and we say, Joe, how are you doing that? And he denies he's doing it at all. It's absolutely amazing. He goes, I'm not doing it. I'm just using the listening skills that they taught us. Joe, come on. We've watched you. So after we started to understand that, Joe was really predicting what screen to go to. And he was doing it by understanding the nature of the nature of the call and some cues that were being set up by the caller. So this is very interesting, and just one of the things that Joe was doing that made him a top performer. But we call this sometimes the secret sauce of top performers. They've cracked the code. So this is kind of interesting, but we can do a lot with this as we start to understand Joe and his peers who are performing at a similar level. And let's just stay on this call center for a few moments. If we look at all the call center representatives, they will form a normal distribution curve. And so that's not surprising. The performance for most, 65% fall dead on average. Joe's performance is 2 or 3, and sometimes even top performers are even 10 times average. So it's quite interesting. But here's what we do now. By understanding what Joe and his peers, his top performing peers, do in this call center, we use that as a design point. Because top performers are, in our industry's language, unconsciously competent. They have cracked the code. I can't explain why it is, but in every case that we have studied, and these have been numerous cases, top performers think about the role, they think about the job that they are doing differently than the average performers. There's a lot of power in that. And so we work to understand that and create what we call the mental model of a top performer. So why is that important? Well, number one, just think about it. If we could clone Joe, what would happen? Our performance curve would shift. And that's what this graphic is trying to illustrate. The original performance curve is the light blue line. The orange line is the shift in the curve. All the green shaded area is business impact because we haven't increased our cost basis one bit. So we are delivering more for the business with the same resources. And there's one other very important aspect of this, and that's if you notice the shape of the curve, the distribution has become more narrow. And why is this important to the leaders in the organization? It's important because now we have more predictable behavior, whether it's Joe answering the phone or Sam or Mary or whoever. And so that type of predictable performance is really sought after in corporate America, in corporations across the globe today. Now, this is one other aspect of this is we really target this top performer drill down on critical roles. There are some roles in your organization that are critical to driving the business. Reflect on that and think about what those roles might be. Those are the roles you need to make sure that you are absolutely pegged on what things they should be focused on and what the mental model of the top performers in those roles should look like. So how do we describe the mental model of a top performer? Well, we do that through this thing that Mark has been talking about called outcomes. Now, we all think of outcomes very broadly as results, touchdowns, baskets scored. But how we define outcomes is those 5 to 7 things that are produced by top performers that lead to the touchdowns. So these are highly predictive. And if we can understand the predictive nature and capture those in these outcomes, and if we go back to Joe and look at this outcome, an accurate prediction of caller issues, we can encapsulate that and take it to others. In fact, that's what we did. So typically there are 5 to 7 outcomes that in aggregate top performers are producing that average performers haven't even thought about. So that's a very powerful notion. And as we look at things like curricula, for example, the traditional way to develop curricula is to ask the question, what do people in that role need to know? So let's find the SMEs. The more SMEs we find, this no circle begins to grow till it's unmanageable, quite frankly. The same is true of the do circle. So when we're building curricula or evaluating curricula, we don't focus on the no or the do. We focus on what is being produced that's of value to the organization, these outcomes. And if we understand that, and if you look at this graphic and go from right to left, we can reduce what we have to teach people, and they will become more impactful in the job. So think about that. And on average, we easily are able to reduce curricula by 30%. There's a tremendous cost savings. There's a tremendous savings from time off the job. It's a very powerful concept, and we get quicker time to competence and more impactful competence at the end. So just to drill down a little bit more or to emphasize these outcomes, here are some other examples. I won't belabor these today, but things like, and these are outcomes that might exist for a salesperson, for example. Up-to-date planning and forecasting spreadsheet, a deep trusted relationship with key client contacts. So if you look at that first one, it's one of the attributes of an outcome is that it's measurable. I think we can all see how we can measure an up-to-date planning and forecasting spreadsheet. We could say, Mary, let's take a look at your spreadsheet, and we could have a very meaningful conversation as a frontline supervisor and Mary. It's less tangible on the deep trusted relationships. And what does that mean? Well, when we're going through and understanding what the outcomes are, it's not just this summary statement, it's all the context and the detail that are associated with that. So for example, when we talk about outcomes, we talk about, and they are defined by the summary statement. They're also, we look at critical success factors. What are the things that we can measure in our organization that would indicate, Mark, that you had deep trusted relationships? Those are the kinds of questions that we end up asking and solving for in our method, which is called a role excellence profile. Other things, importance, difficulty, percentage of the role contribution, interactions within the organization, outside of the organization, tools, resources. What are the things that the top performers are bringing that are facilitating? What is the organization? What barriers are there in the organization? And finally, key task. And key task is an interesting one because top performers are producing these things. We do need to know how they're producing them. But this is only one way. by staying focused on the outcome, we're actually encouraging innovation within the role. Because once it becomes clear to people what they need to produce, they will come up with innovative ways to do that. And then we can update the entire system. It's quite a interesting and sort of closed feedback loop that develops. So, Mark and I, as in the consulting practice, once we have these outcomes, it's like we have gold, because we can do a lot with it. We can create an enabling excellence workshop, deliver that straight to incumbents. We have done that in numerous clients with tremendous impact across the business, and within 4 to 6 to 8 weeks, things are changing, conversations are changing, and people are focusing on the right things, the things that matter. We can take those same outcomes and produce an entire onboarding curriculum. We can look at and inevitably discover non-training issues that require some organizational development type of interventions. We can look at the impact on major initiatives for the company. And as Mark started us in our discussions, we take that, input it into the training for leadership and development, and leaders now are focused on those things that the top line needs to produce. So that's a powerful method, and there's clients of ours that are experiencing tremendous success from that. But now I want to back up for one brief moment and talk about something else that we have observed in our work with top performers. Mark talked about this chaotic world that we work in. Work has changed. I mean, for all of us, it's changed. And if we reflect back and think about to the days of maybe Henry Ford, and he's purported to have said, why is it that every time I ask for a pair of hands, they come with a brain attached? The role of humans in the workplace at that point, for many humans, was very different than it is today. Today, it's cognitive. Everything that we're doing almost is cognitive. And so it's very interesting, and Jeff Colvin released a book in August of last year that's very insightful on this. And he says, organizations can't even begin to get better until leaders acknowledge that human interaction skills are the key to competitive advantage. Now, think about that. As you go back to your respective workplaces, think about that. Because I think in the learning and development function and industry, we haven't really focused in the level of depth that we need to focus on in that. And this is illustrated to us because as we lay these role excellence profiles out across different roles, across different industries, there's some things that we're noticing. One is that, well, this graph, this matrix tries to illustrate this in this way. And if we think about top performers and how they're able to become top performers, what they are really doing is integrating. And so I think the purposeful task axis doesn't surprise anyone. People need to have purposeful tasks to produce things of value for the organization. The one that does surprise us a little bit is even if you take a role like an auditor, an internal auditor in a financial organization, you think about that role and you go, holy cow, they got to be really on their P's and Q's about all the laws and the regulations. And they do. That's the x-axis. But the top performers in a study that we did on internal auditors, they went much further than that. And the thing that separated them most is that they spent the time to build a meaningful relationship with the business owner that they were auditing so that they could have and could communicate in meaningful ways what this audit was really saying and provide the insights that the business leader could then use to start to make the changes in the business that were required for protection of the company. And so what's happening there is this upper right-hand quadrant. top performers, game changers as we call them, are integrating, let's just call it the technical knowledge and the execution of skillful human interactions. And it's more than communication skills or soft skills. They have really, it's the integration that's extremely important. And the thing that I think we miss in a lot of the development programs that we tackle in our functions and in this industry. So this is something that I think to think about, because as technology increases, as obviously it is, the role that people play in the organization is going to rely less and less on the purposeful task and more on being human to one another and truly getting impactful things done in the organization and outside the organization.
So let me leave you with a couple thoughts and I'll summarize. Ultimately, it's about business outcomes. We're all in agreement about that. The best way in which to ensure business outcomes are achieved is by having individuals produce the outcomes, and that's where Butler has spent a fair amount of time expanding our methodology and approach to making that happen. Leadership role is to support that by setting clear direction, by establishing conditions for success, and that happens at all levels. It's leadership in service of individuals producing results. We'll leave you with 3 thoughts. Ultimately, leaders are responsible for delivering those business outcomes because that's how the value is created for shareholders. The best predictor of that is to identify top performer individual outcomes. So benchmark against the best and shift that performance curve. And the role excellence process is really the starting point. It is certainly our firmly held and deeply held belief that success can be increased in organizations by focusing on people and shifting them so they're all producing at a higher level. Thanks very much for your time and thanks for listening to this.